Okay, hello everybody. Great. Welcome to the Cape Cod Museum of Art. I'm Benton Jones, Director of Art, and I'm very excited that we can offer to you on this slushy Cape Cod evening a virtual presentation by ecologist and educator Gil Newton on the ecology of a Cape Cod salt marsh. You can enjoy this from the comfort of your home tonight. I'm dressed so warmly today because I'm pleased to announce that we're getting a new environmentally friendly and efficient boiler, and the installation will be finished tomorrow. So it's rather nippy in here tonight. In this talk, Gil Newton will discuss the unique assemblage of plants and animals and their interactions within a local salt marsh. He will also discuss the ecological and economic importance of marshes in New England. This talk is presented, let's see here. This talk is presented in conjunction with the one-man exhibition by ED Chesnovitch titled Man on the Marsh. Mr. Gilbert Newton is a Cape Cod native who has been teaching environmental and marine science at Sandwich High School and the Cape Cod Community College for many years. His classes include coastal ecology, botany, coastal zone management, and environmental technology. In 2013, he founded and became the first director of the Sandwich STEM Academy. He completed his graduate work in biology at Florida State University. He has also taught and continues to teach classes for the Massachusetts Marine Academy, the Falmouth Academy, Bridgewater State University, and the Waquoit Bay Estuarine Research Reserve. Mr. Newton designed, developed, and was the program director for the Advanced Studies and Leadership Program at the Massachusetts Marine Academy for 14 years. Gil is one of the founders of the Barnstable Land Trust and is the past president of the Association to Preserve Cape Cod. He is the author of several books about the Cape shoreline, including the recent Marine Habitats of Cape Cod and Mysteries of Seaweed, Questions and Answers. Other books by Gil include The Ecology of a Cape Cod Salt Marsh, Discovering the Cape Cod Shoreline, and Coastal Corners of Cape Cod. Gil Newton's books are available for purchase in our museum shop and on our online museum shop. I want to thank Gil for donating to the museum this free talk tonight and the proceeds from the sale of his book at the museum. Just a few tips for our virtual audience. This presentation is best viewed in standard view or speaker view mode in your Zoom settings. Try them both out to see what looks best on your screen and device. At the end of Gil's presentation, you can submit questions to Gil through the Zoom chat function. Before I hand things over to Gil, let me give you a sneak peek at the exhibition that brings this presentation with, bridges this presentation with our Visual Art Museum. The exhibition by artist ED Chesnovitch, Man on the Marsh. I'm going to switch cameras here. Let's see. Okay. Man on the Marsh is a visual documentary of one artist's unique journey of living and working on a Cape Cod salt marsh. And how it has influenced his life and art. Chesnovitch fills his mostly large-scale landscape paintings with bold, saturated color, I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. With bold saturated color and extraordinary mark making, resulting in unique and powerful compositions. He uses oils, mixed media, and pastels to record his observations and expresses his intense connection to the environment in which he lives and works. This exhibition of landscape and Phragmite paintings will leave the viewer in awe of the artist's spectacular and personal vision of the marsh. This exhibition runs through February 7th, 2020. Sorry, February 7th, 2021. A Meet the Artist event is scheduled for January 7th from 3 to 7 p.m. Ed will also be offering a simulcast virtual and in-person demonstration on February 5th from 6 to 7:30. There is one spot left in Ed's Pushing Color 6-week class that begins January 12th. And one last thing, if we lose power, because it seems really windy out there tonight, Gil has offered to do a makeup presentation, which would be posted on our website. Okay, now I give you, let's see if I can get here. Now I give you Gil Newton. There's so many people on this list, I need to find him. There he is. Okay, Gil, you're muted.
Okay,
there you go.
Now I'm okay. And
now
I assume I'm a co-host. Okay, so let me bring up my PowerPoint. Oh, by the way, one thing about losing power, if I should lose my power here in Cotuit, my generator will kick on. Just hang in there. It'll take a couple of minutes and I can get back in again. That happened to me in one of my classes. And I went back in, my students were still there waiting for me. So just be patient with that. So, all right, I'm going to bring up my PowerPoint and hopefully everybody can see that. Everybody see that? I see Jackie out there. Can you nod your head, Jackie? Can you see it? Okay, good. All right, everybody. Well, thank you for inviting me to give this presentation this evening. This is certainly an interesting day weather-wise here in Cape Cod. I think I've heard the phrase winter wonderland about a dozen times today to describe actual beauty of these storms, even though they can be inconvenient. What I want to do for you this evening is take you on a tour of one of the most important ecosystems on Cape Cod, that of a salt marsh. You just saw a quick survey of Ed's beautiful paintings, and I'm sure those of us who live on the Cape have seen salt marshes and are somewhat familiar with them. I want to delve into the details a little bit on the plants and animals and the science behind salt marshes and why they're so important. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to give you a tour of my favorite place, a specific marsh, namely that of Crocker Neck in Cotuit. Crocker Neck is a typical salt marsh, like we see here on Cape Cod. So many of the same plants and animals that we find there, we find throughout the Cape. But every salt marsh is slightly different. This evening, we're going to take a look at this particular one. And all salt marshes are characterized by a very important plant. Several years ago, my students asked me, Professor Newton, what's the most important plant in the world? And of course, they're all important. They all play a critical role. But the one that I selected was this one here. This is called Spartina alterniflora, or the tall cordgrass. You see it growing all along the edges of a salt marsh. And it often is the plant that can be inundated by high tides or storms like we're seeing today. So it raises the question, how can a plant survive in a saltwater environment? Wouldn't the cells lose water to the environment because they go from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration? Wouldn't that increased salt cause the cells to burst or to plasmolyze? And the answer is that Spartina alterniflora has several unique adaptations which allow them to survive in these environments. And one of them is that it gets rid of the salt through the leaves. So in the summertime, when it's growing really robustly, if you walk down to a marsh and you rub your fingers along a blade of grass, you can actually feel the salt crystals and you can even taste them. So that's one of the ways it does that. It gets rid of the salt. Other plants in the salt marsh actually can store the salt, giving them somewhat of a succulent condition. The other thing too is it's sitting in this muck. There's very little, if any, oxygen at all down in the roots. And so Spartina also has some specialized cells which transport oxygen down to the roots and creates a little oxygenated atmosphere around the roots themselves. Plus, the roots are very deep, so they can withstand any kind of strong wave action or coastal damage like we're seeing here on Cape Cod today. So it's very, very important plant because it ultimately supports a large population of animals offshore, mainly shellfish through filter feeding apparatus, as well as many of the fish that will feed on detritus, which is the decomposing plant material from cordgrass that washes out during the tides and ultimately supports a whole food web of very important, economically important animals. So collectively, I picked this one as one of the most, if not the most important plant, knowing that all of them have a very critical role. And this is the summer condition around Crockett. You can see that it grows very tall. It can be several feet in height. Usually this time of the year, it starts to die back and it forms these large mats all along the edges. Now, we're learning a lot about salt marshes and salt marsh ecology and how important they are. Salt marshes are protected under the Massachusetts Wetland Protection Act for many good reasons. First of all, salt marshes act as barriers to the open ocean, particularly during storms, during any kind of erosion or wave action. They tend to protect the upland areas where we live. Another thing about salt marshes is that they're very productive ecosystems. What I mean by that is that they produce a great deal of organic material or food, which in turn supports a large number of animals, both within the marsh and also offshore, as I just said. Productivity in a salt marsh is actually much, much higher than even in our agricultural farms. In addition to that, we're now learning that these coastal wetland systems play another critical role. We've all heard about the problems with climate change and how important it is to reforest many of the areas that have lost trees because the plants take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But it turns out that salt marshes, as well as mangrove swamps in the tropics, are outstanding sources of carbon. They are excellent at sequestering carbon from the air. As a matter of fact, what you see here are all the buildup in dead organic material from previous grasses. These big, thick layers, which are referred to as peat, contain a great deal of carbon that is stored there and is 3 to 5 times more efficient than a tropical rainforest. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to plant trees and reforest the planet, but it also gives us another reason why coastal wetland systems should be protected. Salt marshes also are very important in protecting our aquifer. They help prevent salt water from getting into our freshwater drinking water supply here on Cape Cod. So they're barriers. They are good for storm control and erosion control. They protect our drinking water, and they're very highly productive areas that support a great deal of wildlife. As a matter of fact, salt marshes are also very important places for migratory birds to stop over, usually in late winter or early spring when they're migrating further north. Kind of like when you're going on a trip and you get tired and you get hungry, you stop in a hotel and a restaurant to get some rest and get something to eat. That's what salt marshes do for a lot of migratory birds. So they are very, very important. In fact, I tell my students, when you see those words salt marshes, those S's should be dollar signs, because they do work for us. They provide these valuable ecosystem services all the time. And we'll see as we walk through Crockett Neck how important they are. Another thing about salt marsh systems is they usually are abutting other kinds of ecosystems. And there's a couple here at Crockett Neck. Crockett Neck consists of a large terrestrial environment that abuts out into the water of Popponesset Bay on one side and Quinquisset Cove on the other. And so marshes are often important systems around estuaries, and we know how important estuaries are for commercial shellfish and finfish. This is what the marsh looks like in the fall. You can begin to see some of the cordgrass is beginning to disappear. Right along the edges here, where there's a large population, it's hard to see here, but I'll show you another picture in a minute, of an important group of animals called ribbed mussels. And the ribbed mussels embed themselves in the sediments of the salt marsh, and they also have a canopy layer of a seaweed called rockweed, which I'll also show you in a minute, which provides this zonation as you go from the water's edge up into the terrestrial environment. One of the important things about Crockett Neck, and is important in all conservation issues regarding salt marshes, is that it's really important to keep terrestrial land intact that surrounds the marsh, because the movement of groundwater is from land into the salt water, and anything in the groundwater finds its way into these bays and estuaries. So we know we have a nitrogen loading problem here in Cape Cod. Marshes can trap some of that nitrogen, but excessive nitrogen can also damage a salt marsh. So it's really important to have these buffer zones or these forested, vegetated areas around marshes, as exists at Crockett Neck, which is about 97 acres of land in all. It's really important to maintain these in order to protect the marshes themselves. Because even though the marshes are protected under the Wetlands Protection Act, they're still vulnerable to any kind of damage coming from the land. Another habitat that's important here is the mudflat. And the mudflats around Crockett Neck are really interesting. And I know there's some also interesting ones in other parts of the Cape, like in Wellfleet. There's some fascinating ones there up in Bourne. I've seen some over by the Lyman Reserve that are just absolute major areas for shellfish. And so you have soft shell clams, quahogs, razor clams, many other important, economically important shellfish, but also a few others too that we are not consuming right now, but do play a critical role. And the detritus, that is the decomposing plant material from the grasses, also tends to be consumed by tiny organisms in the mud and in the substrate. So we often don't see these living things, but they're very, very important in the overall ecology of a salt marsh. So marshes are usually connected to several different systems. Here, a forest system, a mudflat, and a bay or an estuary. Now, as the weather, of course, begins to cool in the fall, we start to see it die back a little bit. And eventually it turns brown and it forms these large mats, which can in turn then break apart, decompose, become part of the food web with bacteria, tiny nematode worms, and a whole slew of living things living in the water and in the substrate itself. But remember now, Spartina altiflora still maintains this barrier all around the outside, which can help protect the upland areas from winter storms as well. This is just another example of the zonation that we see in a marsh. Kind of a little hard to see in this picture, but the Spartina is all flattened back in here where I've got my pointer. I hope you can see that. And then there's a row of shrubs which are a little bit higher in elevation around the marsh called marsh elder. Of course, they lose their leaves this time of the year, but they form another distinct zone, as you can see other plants along the edges of the marsh as well. It's interesting that when you look at certain marshes, and my students have done studies and transects in Scorton Creek and Sandwich, Grace Beach and Yarmouth, even all the way down to some of the marshes in Truro and Provincetown, you sometimes see a different assemblage of plant species depending upon the elevation of the marsh. Marshes aren't usually nice and level. Instead, you see they're kind of bumpy and so forth. So you sometimes see different kinds of plant species in the distribution. Now, walking down to the marsh, we're going to see a lot of interesting plants. And of course, one of the most common ones around is the pitch pine. We've all seen pitch pine. Pitch pine is identified by easily identified by a couple of characteristics. If you look at the clump of needles, there's 3 needles in each clump, which is called a fascicle. And in addition to that, they put out their little prickly cones, which is actually the female cone. Many of you might be more familiar with the male cones, which are small brown clusters that release all that yellow pollen in the spring that gets into your homes, gets on the puddles, and some people are allergic to. The cones themselves take about 1.5 to 2 years before they release the seeds. And another thing about pitch pine is that, which is true with a lot of pine species, is that they're somewhat resistant to fire. So Crockinac in the last couple of summers, not last summer, but the 2 summers previous, actually was given a prescribed burn by the town fire department along with approval from the Conservation Commission. And I remember walking out there the day after it happened, and I said to myself, this is horrible. This looks terrible. I was practically in tears. And then the ecologist in me kicked in. And I realized that this is actually going to help the environment there. And as we see in this last summer and since the burns, much of the vegetation has come back. What the fire did is it burned out a lot of the leaf litter that had that caught fire, could have been a very serious fire and threatened some of the homes in the neighborhood. But it released a lot of nutrients out of the soil, and the pitch pine seemed to be fine. Lady slippers came back, the huckleberry came back in abundance. So the area has recovered quite a bit, which is good because some of those parts of Crockinac are also very significant habitats for some endangered animals such as box turtles. So sometimes you'll see prescribed burns in some of these woodland areas around there, one to protect property nearby, but also it's good for the forest. The Cape Cod National Seashore has been doing these kind of prescribed burns for much of their land for many years. It's good management technique, and Crockinac was the recipient of that at least twice in the last 3 years. Another pine species that's common there is the white pine. And the white pine is easily distinguished from the pitch pine because there are 5 needles in each fascicle. And the cones are more longer, they're longitudinal shaped. It has kind of a softer texture to it as well. And white pine was widely used as a source of lumber for homes and for shipbuilding many years ago. So there are parts of the Cape where it's pretty much disappeared, but it's come back in a lot of areas and it's quite abundant and common at Crockinac, as it is in a lot of woodland areas surrounding other marshes on Cape Cod. One of my favorite ground covers is this one here. This is called bearberry. And I bring this up because you often see a lot of these obscure tiny plants growing on sand dune communities and also along coastal banks right near marshes. And this is one of the more common ones. You can see the little berries here. It's an evergreen. I highly recommend people plant it on their property. It's a pretty little plant. It'll spread very slowly, grows in sand. You don't have to water it. You don't have to fertilize it. You can actually grow it, and you can actually buy this in several nurseries here on the Cape as well. But you do see it growing on Crockinac, although if you really want to see a healthy population of this plant, go down to the Marconi area in Wellfleet, and the dunes are just covered with it. It also produces these small fruits, which are important wildlife, a source of food. And that's something to think about, particularly in this year where we had a severe drought during the summer. At Crockinac, I noticed a lot of the ground covers were not producing berries. The beach plums didn't produce fruit this year. So any kind of fruit that's out there for wildlife is going to get them through the winter. And let's hope that today is not a sign of things to come, but it could very well be. Other plants that are important are mosses. And mosses, again, they tend to be overlooked, especially as you go down near coastal areas. But these are some of the early colonizers on dunes and in some of the areas that got exposed because a tree fell over or there's some land that's out there that's now exposed. And they are some of the first plants to come in here. They will actually change the soil a little bit to allow other plants to come in. This is a cushion moss, and there are many other kinds that you see along the edges. I remember my students asked me, you know, why do we have to study mosses in this class? And I said, well, you live in Massachusetts, of course you're going to. That's just to see if anybody's still awake. Okay, actually, here's one that's really interesting for a number of reasons. This is the reindeer lichen, and some people call it a reindeer moss, but it's actually a lichen. And lichens are very interesting. This one in particular grows from the Arctic zone all the way down to the tropics. It's very abundant on some of these coastal banks around Crockett. And what's interesting is that it is highly vulnerable to sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere. So the presence of lichens, the abundance of lichens, is a sign of good air quality, particularly for that parameter, sulfur dioxides. But if you go into one of the big cities like Boston, you often can't find lichens. So there's a little bit of them, but you can't find them as abundant as you see here on the Cape. So that's a good sign. They're also very important because you see them all over the trees and so forth. Don't worry if you have them on your property, they won't hurt your trees, but they will also change the soil to allow some of these other coastal plants to come in and survive. They're actually two organisms in one. It's a symbiotic relationship between a fungus, a filamentous fungus, and a single-celled green algae. And for many years, people thought it was somewhat mutualistic and they both benefited from this relationship. But when they come together, they actually form a whole different species. And it's the only group of living things that I'm aware of that do that. The truth of the matter is, it's probably an example of parasitism because the fungus actually kills some of the algae cells when it captures them out of the soil. But still very, very important and very common. And they're very crispy when it's under drought conditions and dry conditions, but they'll absorb moisture from the air. And after heavy rain or snow, like we see here, they're really cushiony, so much softer. Everybody knows this plant here on the Cape. This is, of course, Toxicodendron or poison ivy. I bring this up because poison ivy is, one, a plant you should avoid, but two, very common in coastal areas. In fact, in Quinquisset Cove at Crockett, there's an island out in the water that is absolutely covered with this. I've named it Poison Ivy Island. I don't know if anybody else calls it that, but I do. And at any rate, you wonder, gee, how can it survive? It's just battered with salt spray and storms, and it's flooded frequently, but it does. And it's also very good on sand dune communities. It can hold the soil in place. You need to avoid it because in all of its tissues, its leaves, its stems, its roots, and even its fruits, and you can see some of the fruits here, it has a substance called urushiol, which if you come in contact with it can cause dermatitis. And all you have to do is come in contact with a leaf or something that's been nibbled on by an insect or it's broken or something, and you can get that skin disease. Some people are very allergic to this. Whenever I get it, I usually get it in the winter because the leaves are gone, and it's nothing but a little twig sticking out of the ground with a little terminal bud on it. But it can grow as a vine, it can grow with a woody stem, it can grow as a shrub. It's really something to be careful of. Good news, in addition to be good for erosion control, these berries are fed on by over 24 bird species. They're not affected by the substance at all. So this is an important wildlife plant, and it's also important for erosion control. Okay, now we come to my favorite group of living things, and you're going to say, I've never met anybody that said this before, but I love the seaweeds. That was my research area. I've written a couple of books on seaweeds, and I never tire of talking about them. So I won't spend the entire time on seaweeds, but I do want to tell you about a couple of them that are really significant. This first one, I'm sure you have all seen. It's pretty common here on Cape Cod, and it washes up on the little beach at Crockett, and you see it in, everywhere else, the salt marshes over at like Gray's Beach in Yarmouth and so forth. This is called Codium, and Codium has also got a common name of dead man's fingers and oyster thief. Codium is an introduced and highly invasive green seaweed that has come into our waters, presumably through a shipment of oysters that came from Japan or someplace in Asia up into Canada and down into New England, probably in the late 1950s, early 1960s. I remember seeing it as a kid because I grew up here, but today it is really bad. And a few years ago, I was collecting some seaweeds for my class in January at Dowse's Beach in Osterville. And this seaweed was so thick in the winter, it was interfering with wave action. And I started getting really curious about it, and I noticed it's really very, very common now. Why is it a problem? Well, first of all, Codium tends to grow on hard objects like shellfish, and it will grow right over the filter feeding siphons of shellfish so they can no longer feed. It can also, it's very buoyant, so it can also remove shellfish from the environment. It can pull out oysters, it can pull up scallops and get on those animals as well. So shell fishermen hate this particular seaweed, and they're actually facing a lot of other potentially dangerous seaweeds right now as well. They used to tear it in two and throw it back in the water again, which is a big mistake because one of the characteristics of invasive species is that they can reproduce many different ways. That gives them a competitive edge. And Codium can break apart asexually in a process called fragmentation and grow two whole new seaweeds. That's because there are no cross walls between the cells. So it's just like the cytoplasm just flowing through like one giant cell. In addition to that, they can also reproduce sexually. They release male and female gametes into the water. But in addition to that, the female gamete under some conditions can grow into a whole new alga without fertilization from the male. And that's a process called parthenogenesis. So Codium can also survive year-round, which gives it another competitive advantage of other seaweeds that may be seasonal and may have a microscopic stage in the winter and only appear in the macroscopic stage in the summer. So this is a very, very invasive organism. How can we control it? Well, there's nothing that eats it, but I'm telling you right now, folks, it makes great compost material. If you have a garden at home, you can collect this seaweed. I'm sure that you want to check with your local regulations about taking anything off a beach, but most towns would say go right ahead and take this one. You don't have to rinse out the salt. I usually take it from the upper portion of the beach where it's dried up a little bit and there's no living animals still on it, and that way it's easier to carry. You can put it in your gardens, you can throw it in your compost pile, use it to overwinter some of your shrubs to protect them from the desiccating wind. It's useful in that sense. So we can get a lot of people to collect this stuff. It might be useful. I was doing a marine science program at one of the hotels in Yarmouth the summer before. Late summer in August, they were invaded by this. That was absolutely covering the beaches, which of course interfered with the enjoyment for their guests. And so they had to come in and truck it all out of there early in the morning before the hotel guests began using the beach. And so this is becoming an issue. I was out with Audubon in a boat, and we dredged up a ton of this stuff. So it's really very common. So that's one of the bad guys that you see in a salt marsh. Here's the good guy. This is rockweed. Fucus fasciculosus. I can tell it's that species because it has these paired air bladders all along the midrib. And by the way, seaweeds are not plants. We can call them plants, but they're really like plants, but they're not true plants. True plants have circulatory tissue called xylem and phloem, which is able to move sugars and solutes and water throughout the plant. But algae don't have that. They're missing that vascular tissue. They don't need it. They're right in the water. They can absorb things directly, but they do photosynthesize. So even though this one's brown, it does make its own food, and therefore it's important as a photosynthetic organism in taking carbon dioxide out of the air and making oxygen too. What makes it important in the salt marsh, however, is that it acts like a canopy all along the banks. Remember those pictures I showed you of the Spartina? Right below that is this layer all around croconet or rockweed, and it has kind of a mucilage texture to it so that when the tide goes out, it retains its moisture. And by retaining its moisture, it can help protect animals that live under this fronds. So if you were to lift up some of the rockweed at low tide, you would see ribbed mussels and hydroids and bryozoans and maybe sea stars and other animals that are present as well, which are hiding and getting protection from the sun. Another thing about them is, I don't know if you can see in the slide here, but on the tips, these are called receptacles, but there are these little tiny bumps all along here. And if we were to section that and look under a microscope, we would see that these are reproductive structures called conceptacles, both male and female. And they release the gametes in the water. They are attracted by a chemical attractant and the physical movement of the water. And they fertilization takes place, they settle back down, and they attach to a substrate or to something like a rock jetty with a little tiny disc-like structure called a holdfast. So again, these are really important seaweeds that we find all along a salt marsh. Do not pop these air bladders, please. I always tell my students that because those air bladders are filled with air and they help float the organism to the surface at high tide so it can maximize photosynthesis. One interesting plant that is another common on the Cape, but we're paying a little more close attention to it, is the eastern red cedar. They often form rows on the outside of marshes before you get down to the water's edge. And the reason I bring this up is because we're all very concerned about one of the phenomena of climate change is rising sea level. And in many parts of the Cape, there's now some documentation that salt marshes are beginning to migrate towards land as much as they can because sea level is rising. There's been some experiments done at Waquoit Bay where they are adding sand to the substrate to try to build up the marsh. And I've heard that that's had with some limited success. But one of the things they've noticed in Falmouth and some other areas is that these eastern red cedar band around there is beginning to die off. And that's a suggestion that the sea level is rising. There's more additional salt spray hitting the leaves and they're not able to survive. They can withstand a certain amount, just like the pines can, but there is some indication that looking at this indicator, this environmental indicator, that the sea level may be rising in some areas. My observations at Crockett Neck is somewhat the opposite. Again, Papaneset Bay is a sheltered bay area, but there's one section of Crockett Neck where I believe it's building up. And what we saw earlier in that marsh, those big chunks of marsh there, they break away and they establish themselves in a muddy area that we call these hummocks, and they can build up a salt marsh. And there does seem to be at least one area of Crockett Neck where we have what I call emergent marsh. And in fact, I think it's going to kind of cut off the area and form a little lagoon there in the future. But it's worth taking a look at. And there is a lot of research going on right now. Okay, you saw some of Ed's beautiful paintings of Phragmites. And a lot of people do think this plant is quite attractive. And I never argue with anyone's aesthetics. But I got to tell you that from an ecological point of view, it is not attractive. Phragmites is a highly invasive plant all along the edges of marshes and freshwater wetlands. It can outcompete any of the native species that are in the area. It can get very tall, 6-7 feet tall. My students did a long-term study of Phragmites over at Scorton Creek in Sandwich a few years ago. And it was so thick an area, they were finding between 50 and 100 plants per square meter. I had another student that went over to the Fort Hill area where there's some Phragmites that are beginning to invade down by the salt marsh there. And he, with permission of the seashore, dug into the sediments nearby, and you could actually see some of the remains of the Rosa rugosa that had been crushed by the Phragmites. So it just grows very quickly. The best way of controlling it is to open up salt water and allow that to come in, because Phragmites cannot withstand saltwater conditions. It can live into somewhat brackish water. Again, we measured up to 15 parts per thousand. We can find it, and salt water is about 32 to 35 parts per thousand, so about half of seawater. But if you get the full seawater in there, it will destroy Phragmites. And there's been a lot of successful Phragmites control programs on Cape Cod, from Provincetown to Barnstable over to the canal where that has happened. Sandwich did a project also over at the game farm with the same results. But you don't want to burn it and you don't want to mow it, because what that does is it sends a hormonal signal down to the roots to grow more plants. And it's basically, it's a stressor. And so the plant says, whoops, something's happening. So it starts to put out some more plant life. My friend Nina Coleman, who is the manager at Sandy Neck Beach, also did some remarkable research for her master's, where she had discovered Phragmites in the swales between the dunes at the Sandy Neck Beach in Barnstable, where there are several important rare and endangered plant species. She took a form of Roundup, a herbicide, and injected it into the stem of the Phragmites, and just a certain concentration so that it would only kill the Phragmites, but wouldn't damage anything else in the environment. And she was very successful at this. Very labor intensive, of course. You could never do this for a place like Scorton Creek, but it does help in some of those areas, those sensitive areas where she was working. She has said recently that she has to go back and do it again, because Phragmites will come back after 3 or 4 years. But that's another way of controlling it in a limited basis. This is some of the other plants we see in a marsh. This is salicornia, the sea pickle. This is an edible species, although I find it rather salty, but it was used as a relish in a pickle many years ago. And it turns bright purple in the fall and kind of brown in color in the winter. Sea lavender is a beautiful plant you see in late summer, early fall. Not the best photograph. If you really want to see a healthy population of it, go over to the Eastham Visitor Center, the National Seashore, and walk along that trail. And it's really abundant in August. For a while, though, people were picking it for dry flower arrangements, and several conservation commissions realized that if you do that, it's never going to be able to set seed. So they went on an educational campaign in many towns to encourage people to take pictures, don't pick the plant. It seems to be working, because I have seen this plant increasing now in many areas on the Cape. When you see it in a marsh, it's really beautiful. It's a bright purple little plant growing right in the middle of the Spartina. So let's talk about some of the animals. This is the ribbed mussel I mentioned earlier. Ribbed mussels embed themselves in the banks along a salt marsh, and they are very powerful. They have these strong structures called byssal threads, which hold them together, and they embed themselves, like I said, before the tide comes in, and they can filter feed. You might have seen this. This is called the stout tagalus. Many people confuse it with a razor clam. It's related to it, but it's found in salt marshes. It gets the same stout, so it's not as long as the razor clam is. Again, very common in Crocker Neck. Oh, this is a picture of the ribbed mussel embedded itself amidst some of the algae and so forth. Its predator are sea stars or starfish. They're a very interesting way of feeding. They get into a little tug of war with the mussel. The mussel, of course, is really clamping tight. The sea star is a much stronger animal, and it begins to pry open the shell just a little bit. Then a remarkable thing happens. The stomach of the sea star comes out of itself into the mussel where it can digest the animal. So the mussels have no chance if there's a population of sea stars in the area. Crocker Neck is a place where there's a lot of quahogs. I mentioned many of the mudflats around salt marshes on Cape Cod have a lot of commercially important shellfish. This is what it looks like. You can actually age a quahog by looking at the really deep grooves along the shell. This is a slipper snail. We have a lot of them around Cotuit and Barnstable. In fact, it looks like ground zero if you go over to places like Dowses or Craigville Beach. It's also called the boat snail and is pretty common in sandy beaches. Periwinkle snails, along with mud snails, are also found in these areas. I think I have another picture of periwinkle snails that you can see. Periwinkle snails are introduced into our waters too, but people just accept them as being part of the environment now. And sometimes that can happen. A species can be introduced, it just kind of becomes very common, but it coexists with other species. It doesn't necessarily outcompete other species. So the periwinkle is established here, but it is an introduced animal. In the bay itself, there are some healthy eelgrass beds, not as healthy as they used to be, but in the eelgrass beds themselves, which is a true flowering plant, it's not a seaweed, you often find populations of scallops, which you see right here. And look at all the slipper snails around the scallop shell here as well. Scallop shells, of course, have that little jet propulsion movement in the water, You can see all the rows of blue eyes when you look at them. But that's another animal that you may find abutting salt marshes. These are the periwinkle snails. You got to have like a little rocky area to see them. Barnacles can also grow in here as well. The barnacle is an interesting animal. It's the only crustacean that will spend its adulthood upside down. What it does is it glues its head, the larvae in the water, glues its head to a substrate for the rest of its life, and then it's able to kick its feathery feet in the water to filter out small food particles swimming by in the water column. Barnacles have an affinity for other barnacles too. So you often see large colonies of barnacles together. And I asked some students once, we noticed that there was an old pier in Sandwich that was covered with barnacles. And I asked them, would they be interested in doing a project comparing the size here, this is known as the operculum, this opening, the size of the operculum and barnacle as you get down closer to the water. Was there a difference in sizes? And the students didn't know what they were getting into. They said, sure, we'd like to do that. So they signed on. So I said, okay, good. Now you have to measure every barnacle that's out there. And there was a couple of thousand, I think, but it took them a while, but they were able to show a correlation, which was kind of nice. Have you seen one of these? Believe it or not, folks, I took this picture at Crockett Neck in September. This is a Portuguese man-o'-war. I have never seen one there, and this is the only time I've seen one at Crockett Neck. When I was a child growing up on the Cape, I remember seeing them occasionally. And of course, when I was a student in Florida, I saw them. But recently, we're seeing more reports of them. The hospitals have been reporting people getting stung by these. The Physalia, or the man-of-war, is not a true jellyfish. It's related to them, but it's not a true jellyfish. This is the sail that most people will see. But the dangerous part is underneath. We have these very long tentacles with some very powerful nematocysts or stinging cells that they capture their prey with. If you were to come in contact with it, you can be badly injured. You can go into a coma, it can affect your respiratory system, or you can just have, what feels like a burn on your arm. And apparently there were quite a few jellyfish stings this last summer, as well as stings from this animal here. What's interesting is, why do we see it now? Why is there an increase? And I suspect it's because our water is warmer. I'm seeing other changes as well. I've seen some changes in some of the seaweeds along the beaches, but I think the reason we saw these this late summer and early fall is because they're coming up on the Gulf Stream and the water was warmer, as it has been the last couple of years. This is another unusual animal I found at Crockett Neck. I took this picture a few weeks ago. These strange looking animals are actually sea cucumbers. And notice they're in the bed of red algae, as we had an algae bloom. There were about 50 of them on the beach, and we were picking them up and putting them back in the water. A sea cucumber is related to starfish. It's related to sea urchins and sand dollars. It has tube feet. It also has a very unusual ability to release portions of its respiratory tree and digestive system if it is disturbed. And it will regenerate new ones. Some of them are filter feeders, some of them are bottom feeders on small phytoplankton or detritus material. But I don't know why I'm seeing them at Crockett Neck. I just saw a whole bunch of them there, and I had to take that picture. They really don't look like an animal at all, but that's what they are. This is sargassum here, by the way. There are a lot of birds. I mentioned migratory birds throughout the area, but there's one that's been overwintering the last few years, and that is, of course, this beautiful great blue heron, the bird with the largest wingspan here in Cape Cod. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen blue herons before. I think there's at least a pair of them at Crockett Neck, possibly more. I've seen a lot of them also in nearby in the Santua River area. And the bird likes to feed at low tide in the creeks and in the pans of the marsh for small fish. The birds nest in the tops of trees. And I don't know if you've ever flushed out one of these birds, but they make a squawking sound like I think a pterodactyl must have sounded like. I mean, it really is a loud, loud sound. So a beautiful bird. My favorite crab is found in the salt marsh. This is the fiddler crab, and this is a male fiddler crab. You tell it's a male because of the large claw here, which the male uses in courtship display and in defense. The fiddler crabs are probably among the most important crustaceans in a marsh. They dig their holes in those muddy flat areas that I showed you earlier. You see the little balls of sand and mud outside the holes. At Crockett Neck, if you go down there on a hot, humid day at low tide in late August, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of them scurrying around. They feed on small particles of food that's in the substrate. They're an important food source themselves for a lot of birds and also for some terrestrial animals like raccoons who come down into the marsh. They aerate the marsh when they dig their holes, and they fertilize it with their wastes. Now, if the male loses its claw in a battle, it can regenerate another claw on the other side. So some of them are left clawed and some of them are right clawed. And I was teaching a group of high school students at Waquoit Bay a year ago, and I mentioned that to them at the beginning of the class, which went on for a week. And they said, well, we're going to keep records of all the fiddler crabs that we find, which ones are left-handed, which ones are right-handed. And I said, okay, not the best scientific study, but just out of curiosity. And they collected about a couple of hundred of them. And do you want to know? It was 50-50. 50% were left clawed and 50% were right clawed. So that was kind of interesting. One of the more edible species that we have in estuaries and around marshes is the blue crab, Calanectes. Blue crabs are beautiful animals. You can tell by blue crab by these sharp points here and the 9 little points along the edge of each margin. And of course, the blue color. You do not want to pick one up alive because they can move their claws around, can pinch very badly, but they are good eating. Blue crabs are being studied right now in places like Massachusetts Maritime Academy, where I teach a class, and other places for their size to see if ocean acidification, which is the lowering of the pH, the more acidic waters due to carbon dioxide in the water, is affecting their size, because it can affect the ability of some of these animals to get calcium carbonate out of the water. So there is a pair of, there's more than a pair, at least 2 ospreys at Crockett Neck. Of course, they've gone south now for the year. Ospreys are another beautiful bird. I'm sure you all love watching them fish. They can account for the diffraction of light when they go diving into the water for the fish, carry it in their talons up to the nest for their young. This is an environmental success story, and we often hear about all of the problems facing the world today, and we do have many challenges. But I am always an optimist, and I am optimistic with my students. I'm not a gloom and doom scientist, and I like to point to this story to show that we can improve the environment. Because when I was growing up, you didn't see ospreys. You often didn't see any kind of bird of prey. And that's because we were just spraying a pesticide called DDT everywhere to control mosquitoes primarily, but then later the gypsy moth. It was interfering with an enzyme which allowed the birds to lay their eggs. And so they were laying eggs with the shells are too thin, or there were no shells at all. So you had an aging bird population. The American eagle, pelicans, any bird at the top of the food web was impacted by this. And eventually we found DDT in the tissues of every human too, and it was a suspected carcinogen. So it was banned for the most part in the early 1970s. It took a while for it to cleanse. It took about 10, 15 years for it to break apart, and eventually the environment, recovered. And now these animals are off the endangered species list. They're very common. I bet every one of you have seen ospreys. They're all over the Cape, and they're beautiful birds. They also have an uncanny ability for when they migrate. I always think this is kind of cool. They seem to know to leave by early October, and they come back by around the 3rd week of March. It has nothing to do with the weather. It's almost like they have a timeshare up here or something, and then they're back again. But this is a success story, and we need to remember that as we start to address some of these other environmental challenges that we face. So how many of you remember the winter of 2015? Again, growing up on the Cape, I don't think I ever saw a winter like that. And I don't think I'm exaggerating. We had weeks and weeks of one blizzard after another and temperatures in the 0. This is Popponesset Bay at Crockett Neck, frozen solid. I hope that's not what our winter's going to be like this year. I'd much rather have a winter like last year. Not that I would walk out here because that's salt water, and of course it's probably not safe. but it was difficult getting down here and taking this photo because the path was covered with ice and had been for weeks. But I had to have my crock and neck fixed, and I had to get down there, and so I took this photo. This is a picture I really like because this is what you often see in salt marshes. This is that decomposing plant material. This is that detritus that we call. I see this is food. So when the tides and waves pick this up, it takes it out into the water and supports a large population of living things. This is a picture I took a few weeks ago. We had an algae bloom at Crockett. You might recognize this setting. An earlier picture was here. This is a red alga, which I identified as Gracilaria. There's another one that's creating havoc in our area right now called Heterosiphonia, which looks a lot like this. They're both invasive species, and this is where I found a lot of those sea cucumbers that I've washed up too. I don't know what the cause of this is. We've tested the waters out there. I'm guessing that there's been some localized nitrogen loading issues. This was the seaweed. There was a big problem over Waquoit Bay for several years. It still is in some times of the year, and it just makes these layers here. That's not good. Seaweeds are becoming an issue in many parts of the world because when they do die and decompose, not only do they smell bad, but in some cases they can release hydrogen sulfide, which is a toxin. Not that this did here, but the other problem is when it's out in the water, it can block off sunlight to eelgrass beds. And during that process of decomposition, bacteria consume the oxygen, so it lowers the dissolved oxygen in the water, and that's a problem for shellfish. And that's a big problem for shell fishermen. Here in Barnstable, I was talking to the director of the Barnstable Water Coalition a couple of weeks ago, and they've identified many areas in the town that are going through this problem right now. I think this is a Cape-wide problem, and I think it needs to be addressed. Okay, this is my last slide, and is, I think, my most beautiful slide. This is the large area that a lot of people call a tide pool, but it's technically referred to as a pan. And it's got to be the most photographed site at Crockett Neck. There's a trail that goes up here. There's a little walkway that people can sit on. And I want to point out to this little thing right here. This is a small pan. You can barely see it. And this small pan, I take students out there, we form a circle, and to convince them that the marsh is like a shock absorber protecting our land, I have everybody jump up and down. Actually, the earth moves when that happens. Call it quaking earth. And it really illustrates it better than anything, that the water gets absorbed and all of this energy gets absorbed here, protecting where we live. So if you do get a chance to go out there or go out to any salt marsh, keep that in mind because it is really, really important. Okay, I'm going to stop share, but before I answer any questions, I just want to show you two more things. One, this is a very important seaweed. I don't know if you can see that. I'll hold it up close. It's a herbarium of something called sea lettuce. Sea lettuce is another common one that you'll see in a lot of bays and estuaries. And it's got its good points and its not so good points. When you see a huge abundance of sea lettuce, that's a sign there's a lot of nitrogen loading going on. Shoestring Bay over in Mashpee is every spring you see a lot of this, and some of the Three Bays areas too in Barnstable. So that can be a problem. But sea lettuce is also edible, and it's actually more nutritious for you than garden lettuce. Now, I wouldn't go out and grab it off the beach and throw it into your salad because it does grow in areas where there's a high amount of septic runoff. But in places where it's been washed, it's cleaned, it's sold commercially, it's often used in miso soups, for example. It's got more vitamins and protein, and it's really I'm back. I don't know why I keep getting muted. But at any rate, let me see if I can finish up. This is the horseshoe crab, and this is actually a molt of a horseshoe crab. Horseshoe crabs are really important animals. If I had to end my talk in picking one of the most important animals, it's this one. Horseshoe crabs have a substance in their blood called LAL, limulus amebicide lysate, which we use to test pharmaceuticals and surgical equipment for the presence of bacterial endotoxins. So if you've had surgery or you've had a flu shot, and I understand it's been used to test for the safety of the recent COVID-19 vaccine, you owe a lot to this animal. It probably has saved thousands of human lives. In addition to that, this is a harmless animal. It's been on the earth for over 400 million years. It's not a true crab. It's more related to spiders and scorpions. But it's really, it can't hurt you at all. You can pick it up. If you do, pick it up like this. Never pick it up by the tail because it's attached to internal organs. This is a female. You can tell because it's got these little pincers up at the top here. If it was a male, they'd be like little boxing gloves. And it's a molt. It molts from the head, unlike true crabs, which molt from the back. So this is a really, really important animal to have around. It's got like something like 9 eyes, got a pair of compound eyes here, and a lot of little eye spots underneath. I could say a lot more about the horseshoe crab, but it's really an important animal. And I have found little baby horseshoe crabs in some of the pans at Crockett Neck. So they do come into these marsh areas, and they're really, really important animals. Okay, I have been talking steadily for 1 hour. I hope I haven't bored any of you. It's really hard to tell if anyone has any questions. I don't know how you're going to do that.
There are a few questions here. I can read them aloud if you'd like, Gil.
Please do, because I can't see the chat, so that would be fine.
Okay, there's one asking to see the sea lettuce once again.
Sure, I'll hold that up for you. This is known as a herbarium. And by the way, it looks just like its namesake, lettuce. And there's another one. There's 2 species we have. Ulva lactuca is the common one. It's 2 cells, and then there's one called monostroma, which has got a single cell. But it's sea lettuce, and yeah, it's a really important seaweed along our coast.
Another question here is: what are the main organizations working to preserve the marshes?
Oh, there are a lot of them. First of all the local conservation trusts. I know Jackie Barton. We owe a great deal to her for decades, who worked with the Barnstable Land Trust as its executive director. And these organizations protect upland areas that surround marshes. They often identify these sensitive areas. But really, there's so many other good groups in addition to the Land Trust, the Association to Preserve Cape Cod, Waquoit Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, the Center for Coastal Studies, all of the facilities in Woods Hole. We are very fortunate, Cape Cod Museum of Natural History, I know I'm leading people out. We are very fortunate to live on Cape Cod, where there are so many people who care deeply about it. And I'd like to point out Ed with his beautiful drawings, the art at the museum. Actually, that helps people appreciate the environment. I believe. So this union of art and science, which the museum is doing, I think deserves credit as well.
There are a lot of comments to that effect saying thank you very much to you, Gil.
Okay.
Their excellent talk, informative presentation, fabulous, wonderful. One person is asking if this will be made available, if the recording will be made available, and I did record it tonight, so with your permission, we might be able to offer it on our website.
Absolutely.
So that's something to look forward to.
One other thing, if you would like to also continue to support the museum, I've written a lot of books. So here's my self-promotion here, but I've actually written a book called The Ecology of a Cape Cod Salt Marsh about Crockett Neck. And there's several others. You might be interested in marine habitats of Cape Cod and also discovering the Cape Cod shoreline. All the proceeds go to the museum and they are available at the museum gift shop.
I know Ed is with us as a participant here tonight. I don't know if you'd like to say anything, Ed, but I'm going to make you a co-host if there's anything that you'd like to add. In the meantime, let me just thank you again, Gil. It was very informative and fascinating. Who knew that the marsh with that special smell was so dynamic and vital to our lives here on the Cape and beyond. Remember, you can purchase his books through our website and our museum shop. Come visit us. We'll be open late tomorrow from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. for holiday shopping. It might be a little chilly until noon, about noon tomorrow. That's when they expect to have our new boiler up and running. So come join us. We'll have, we also have a juried members exhibition titled Changing Tide in conjunction with Ed's exhibition and an exhibition of works from the Falmouth Art Center. If you enjoyed tonight's presentation, please consider making a donation to the Cape Cod Museum of Art. You can do that through our website, www.ccmoa.org.
I did see one more. I can see the chat now, and I did see one more question. It says,
Okay.
do I ever do marsh tours? And the answer is yes. I do Crockett marsh tours for the Barnstable Land Trust. Yep. Sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm just saying, I just saw another question there. I do marsh tours for the Barnstable Land Trust at Crockett 3 or 4 times a year. So if you go to their website, you can see when the next one's coming up.
Great. I'll just finish the website link there for any donation. It would be www.ccmoa.org/donate. So if that is all, signing off from the CCMOA, stay safe, warm, and inspired by our extraordinary marshes. I'll leave you with a last overview of Ed Chesnovich's exhibition in silence. So have a great night, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Bye, Jackie.